Hello and welcome to the video. This video is one of a series designed to help those of you that are relatively new to the hobby to get some of the tips and tricks and experience from older pilots that a lot of you struggle to get because you're not part of a radio control club. The number of RC clubs kicking around don't seem to be getting any bigger, but there's an awful lot of new people coming into the hobby, getting into fixed wings and multi-rotors. So this video is going to talk about how to make a model easier to fly, and in this one we're going to focus on fixed wing. However, if you're interested in making quadcopters easier to fly, then I'll also post a link below when I've done that video as well. Hopefully by getting to the end of this video you'll have picked up some tips and tricks, and all of this is based on my experience learning to fly and also the experience of teaching quite a few friends and family how to get into the air as well. There are no shortcuts into learning to fly. It's one of those things that you have to go through the knocks and get through all those crashes behind you in order to learn all the lessons that you need to. But there are some things that can help you get into the air and make it less of a frustrating experience. So if you're an experienced pilot, there is going to be nothing in this video that's probably going to be news to you. But if you are one of those pilots that hasn't got anyone around you that you know that's flying radio control, hopefully this is going to be of use. So before I get into the nitty-gritty talking about flight controllers and planes, central gravity, throw, radio setups and things like that, we're going to start with the basics. A couple of pilots that I've helped get flying recently have struggled because they've chosen the wrong model. It's very tempting when you first start out to go and buy a scale Spitfire or one of those kind of planes and then try and fly it. And I would never recommend those kind of planes for a first-time model. By design, models like the Spitfire, the ME-109, those kind of things are designed to be fighters, so they are nice and nimble and quite quick in response. And because of that, you have to be flying them all the time. If you lose your concentration for a second, there's a chance that it's going to roll over on you and do something impressive. If you're a new pilot, then I direct you to one of those really good new pilot planes. I recommend personally the Bixler 2. I've had loads of people go through the Bixler 2 and it takes an awful lot of punishment, but it's really nice because it's easy to fix. Foam planes, I know lots of people look down on them and think they are toy grade, but a lot of the modern foam planes and wings are very sophisticated. But the great thing about modern foam is that if you have a hot glue gun, you can repair something that's pretty badly damaged very easily. An example of how easy foam is to put back together is the recent review that I did of the Super Kinetic. Now, I wouldn't necessarily recommend that as a first-time plane for two reasons. One, it has a tendency to tip stall at really low speed, so you have to be a bit careful of that. And that means that when you go too slow, one of the wings drops unexpectedly and it starts to roll over without you touching any of the controls. And the second thing is the prop and motor at the front. So when you hit the ground, you tend to find that the nose gets a little bit crumpled, the motor potentially can be damaged, and a lot of soil and grit can get inside the motor, which doesn't do it any favors. And you're probably going to snap the prop. So I would recommend getting one with the prop mounted ventrally at the back. That means where the top fin of a shark would be. If the motor's up there, it's kind of out the way and hopefully won't hit the ground when you have the inevitable crashes that you're going to have while you're learning. Other thing to look for a trainer plane is look for planes that have relatively high wings. Now, things like the Bixler and Skywalkers do, the center of gravity, or where the plane naturally balances when you have the battery in, is below the wing. So there's that natural little bit of stability that the plane has, which helps you fly as well. That's also the way that some other planes that are very easy and fun to fly, things like the Tundra, things like the Bushmule, even actually something like the Walrus or Night Walrus, they are all planes that have this same kind of feature, which makes them beautiful models to fly and very, very forgiving for all kinds of pilots, but especially for new pilots. In my experience, trying to learn with the wrong model is just going to end up being a very expensive proposition as you destroy the model within a handful of flights and you're going to throw away a couple of £100. The things like the Bixler and those kind of planes are relatively inexpensive, and if you really damage it, then you know what? If you can't repair it with hot glue, you can just get another one. And be prepared to go through a couple of planes learning to fly. That's just part of the hobby. So there's no point getting a £500–600 plane to practice with because you'll destroy it. I'd recommend getting hold of a simulator for your computer. There's loads of different sims around. I use Phoenix here, but there's Real Flight. There's loads of different ones. and you can spend those times where it's not nice enough to fly, or you only have a spare 15 minutes. You plug your radio into the computer and use it like a USB controller, and you can fly a virtual plane around and get the practice in. The great thing about a simulator is when you make a mistake and you crash, it doesn't cost you anything. You just hit the reset button and away you go. And it is not a substitute, in my experience, for the real thing, because the real thing will make your heart pound in your chest in a way a simulator won't. But it will give you the muscle memory that if something happens in real life that you've had in the sim lots and lots of times, there's a chance that your hands will correct it before your brain's even had the time to think about what the heck's going on. When you do fly normally, then I'd recommend have some decent height. There's a maximum ceiling or height that you can fly at in most places for radio controlled aircraft, but having the model high enough means that if you do make a mistake, you have time to recover it. Most of the crashes that I see with friends and family tend to be because they're flying below treetop level and they make one little mistake, and before they have a chance to realise what they've done and correct it and get it all sorted, it's already smashed into the ground. So have a little bit more height and practice just flying around. The thing with flying around is it's very tempting when you're a new pilot, is once you've got it in a situation where it seems to be flying in a circle at a reasonably constant altitude, you just grimly hold on to those sticks and desperately try and maintain that. And actually that's not what you're really trying to do. Fly with straight sections, so fly in big kind of oval shapes, and don't forget to reverse the direction that you're going around that oval in the sky every couple of goes. Quite a few pilots that I know, and if I'm not careful, can start to fall into the trap, have one particular way they like to fly. I really like flying anti-clockwise, and then I have to stop myself and make sure I fly clockwise as well. Otherwise, you find that you develop a real tendency for one way over the other. So fluctuate regularly as you're flying around to get that experience under your belt. So it doesn't matter which way the plane is flying, you're always capable of taking control and bringing it in safely. Last point on this slide is start really simply. Everyone has their own particular experience when they're learning to fly. Some people take to it naturally. Some people it takes ages and ages to master individual parts. For me, things like nose in flying, or that's when the model's coming towards you so that the roll is reversed. So if you put the roll command to the right, the model rolls to the left, etc. Those things are really tricky for me and took me ages. Some of my mates had that down within a handful of flights. For me, it took me a really long time, and it was the simulator that finally helped me crack that just by keeping practicing. So everything will take its own time. Don't think that just because your mate's getting further ahead than you, or you're seeing it on YouTube and it looks really easy, it probably isn't. It's just that they've been doing it for longer or have a little bit more experience. So now we've talked about all that prep, let's talk about things you can do to the model and radio that will actually help you to fly better. The first thing I would say is make sure that your model is set up correctly. I have a video on simple model setup, and I'd recommend you go and have a look at that. I'll put a link in the description. That video talks about all the things you need to do to make sure that the plane is mechanically set up well. And having things like servos at 90 degrees so that you have an equal throw on your control surfaces at the back of all of the wings and the tail moving the same each direction are really important stuff. If you try to fly a badly set up plane, it will always be a challenge even for an experienced pilot. If the plane's set up well, it's going to behave in the way you expect most of the time, and it will give you a better flying experience. The other tip is get the center of gravity right on the model. 5mm can make all the difference. Center of gravity is usually included in the manual, but I would always just double check it as you're flying. If in doubt, start with the center of gravity a little bit more towards the nose. I had one plane, if you remember, it was the Vampire from Hobby King, and the centre of gravity was wrong in the manual. I set it up as per that, and it was tail heavy. And even with my many years of flight experience, it was a handful to try and bring it into land, and I ended up damaging the nose a little bit, which I was very upset about. Check the forums as well for people's recommendation of where the centre of gravity is. That is the single biggest thing, that if your centre of gravity isn't right, then you're going to have a problem. Make sure you're using the right battery, and make sure that you've got a bit of Velcro around the battery as well, so it doesn't move in flight and move that centre of gravity backwards or forwards and change how the plane's behaving for you. Next thing is balance the prop. You don't necessarily have to do this, you can get away with it, but a lot of the props that I find come with bind and fly or power and fly kits are blooming horrible. They're cheap and cheerful, and you can tell that they are not balanced because as soon as you run the motor up with holding the plane in your hand, then it feels like it is wobbling around like crazy. Balancing the prop reduces the amount of vibration going into the model. Planes aren't designed to handle lots and lots of vibration. If you have a flight controller in a plane or a stabilizer, that can really confuse the heck out of the sensors inside those things that are trying to figure out how the plane is sat in the air. And it also puts a lot of additional stress on things like the motor mounts and the motor bearings. So for the sake of 5 minutes, do yourself a favour and balance the prop. Again, I've got a video on that if you want to go and watch it. Last thing about the model is do a pre-flight check every time. Had quite a few friends had crashes because they skipped this bit, and I'll put my hand up here. I've had a couple of crashes where I have become complacent and rushing and have missed the pre-flight check, and the hobby decided to just remind me by having a nice little crash that I was being an idiot. Do perform a pre-flight check and make sure that everything is nice and tight, that none of the connecting nuts and bolts have come loose so that it might pop off when you're flying. Do things like make sure all the surfaces are free moving. One of my friends was trying to repair his plane and managed to get a lot of hot glue in one of the hinges for his ailerons and then wondered why he couldn't turn correctly. And the last thing I'll say is make sure that you've got a full battery in the model. Very easy when you're trying to do everything else. Occasionally you'll forget or think the battery's fully charged and it's not, and the plane will be halfway through your intended little flight and then suddenly all hell will break loose because you lose control of everything. Just be careful of that. Have a little discipline for how you do your batteries. I personally have these little battery marker things. These are from Hobby King. I'll put a link in the description. I have these in all my batteries, and when they're used I just pop the slider to show red, and then I know that that's one I shouldn't touch again. Lots of things you can do on the radio to make it easier to fly. First one is add something called exponential to the main three controls that controls the pitch, roll and yaw of the plane. Now, what exponential does, again, I've got a video here, I'll link to it in the description down below, but it makes the controls less sensitive about the middle position. Now, there's some quite sniffiness in the forums about how much expo you should add and whether or not it's cheating. And in my humble opinion, whatever helps you fly the plane and enjoy the hobby is a good thing. In a plane that's quite nippy, I'll add something like 25-30% expo on the aileron and elevator and 15% on the rudder. On a much more docile plane, something like a Bixler 2, then I will add something like 15-20% on all of the control surfaces. And that helps a new pilot who tends to overmove and overcorrect the sticks, particularly when things are starting to go wrong. It just stops you making the problem worse and gives you very fine control just to make sure the plane is flying great. Do think about reducing rates and the movement of your control surfaces. The manuals that come with the models usually have some kind of recommendation on how far the ailerons, the elevator and rudder should move in a traditional plane, or the wing surfaces for the elevator and aileron movement. Remember, those are maximums. You don't have to have that much. If you are a new pilot, then potentially think about reducing that travel by about 40%. So only have about 60% of the travel. So if it's supposed to move 20 millimeters up and down, then only add in 12 millimeters of travel just to make it a little bit more docile. You can use dual rate, so you can switch between the higher and lower movements on the controls. So if you have a little bit of height and you start to have a good flight and it's starting to click and you want to do rolls and loops and have a go at those kind of things as you get more confident with the plane and your experience is building, then you can turn those control surface movements up and then you can do those kind of moves. But to start off with, don't give yourself full movement on most planes, just because all it's going to do is when you do panic and slam the control over to its limit, the plane is going to react violently and you're not going to have time to sort it out before it comes in contact with the ground. Expect to trim the model in flight. So the way that works is that when the model's flying, you'll find that if you let go of the sticks, it will probably roll to the right or roll to the left, or the nose will go up and down. The little trim tabs by the side of the control on the radio are there to be moved to correct any of that natural tendency. So if you find that your plane is gently rolling to the right, so you have to keep the control pushed over to the left slightly for the roll, then if you put a couple of clicks of trim at the bottom to correct that, so when you let go of the stick the plane flies straight and level, that's the way it's supposed to be. Expect to trim a model pretty much every flight, because you might not be putting exactly the same weight of battery in exactly the same spot, so the center of gravity might move a little bit. And you also might find that after a nasty crash, the geometry of the plane might have changed very slightly as you've stuck it all back together, and it might need another couple of clicks of trim. Once you've got the plane trimmed, just take your fingers off the controls and just trim out any tendency that's there. Last comment on the radio, do add things like a throttle cutoff switch. So if you accidentally bump the throttle channel as you are holding or moving the model, then the prop doesn't start. That can tend to be a little bit scary if it ever happens to you. But if you have a switch on the radio that means that that can't happen, that's a great idea. Lots of radios these days, when you create a model like this, will add that kind of safety feature in by default anyway, but refer to the manual for your radio for how to set it up. Last things before we finish, do remember to perform the high five test before every flight. That is just where you move each of the sticks in turn, and you should, standing behind the model, watch all the control surfaces rise to meet that stick in the direction it's moving. It does a couple of things. It confirms that nothing has changed and you haven't accidentally managed to get the wrong model on the radio, that you haven't accidentally changed anything in that model that you didn't mean to when maybe you thought you were editing another model memory. Also confirms that the controls are free and clear and that the servo linkages are all nicely connected, and also reminds you of which switches do what. You'll find that once you have a couple of models, you'll tend to use the same switches on the radio for the same things. I have the same switch that I always use for flight mode, the same switch that I always use for throttle safety, the same switch that I always use for dropping the flaps. But occasionally, because of the complexity of the model with something like a flight controller, something may have moved. So it's a good chance for you to just double check on the radio how it's all set up. You could also consider adding a stabilizer or a flight controller into the model as well to support you as you are learning to fly. It is a crutch and it is an aid, but things like the ZOHD, Dart, Orbit and Nano Talon all have stabilizers in. Lots of Horizon Hobby products do as well, and I'm hoping that people like Hobby King will start to bring it beginner planes that also have stabilizers in as well. And that just means that if your brain completely locks up, if you let go of the sticks, then it will right itself and then fly straight and level. You obviously have to be a little bit careful with things like that and make sure that things like failsafe are set up on the radio, because you don't then want that plane flying out the edge of the field and flying onto the next town and disappear out your life forever. The very last comment I'll give you is just to remind you to expect to crash a lot. When we are learning to fly, and actually when you are proficient and you're flying, you will crash an awful lot, and every time you crash, use it as a learning experience. Almost every time a crash happens, it'll be down to something you have done. You didn't make sure that the battery was fully charged, you didn't check that the linkages weren't secure on the plane, you've incorrectly routed the antenna on the receiver. Every time you have a crash, take the time to learn from it and make sure that that mistake isn't repeated in the future. And this again is why you need to choose a model that's easy to repair. I recommend a foam model and hot glue, and you'll be able to put some pretty terrible damage together in pretty short order. And also, when you are going out to pick up the pieces when you do crash, and it will happen, then don't just pick up the pieces muttering under your breath and then stomp back to the edge of the field to stuff it all in a bag and take it home. Spend a little bit of time in the crash site making sure that you have all the pieces. Because if you get home and then find that you're missing half of the motor mount, then trying to find that spot where you crashed again in a big field is going to be next to impossible. So the temptation is to go out there, pick it up, swear at it, and bring it back in disgust. Just take a breath, take your time, and make sure you've got all the pieces before you walk away from that crash site. So hopefully that's been helpful for those of you who are new pilots that are learning to fly. My top tips are: make sure you've got the right plane, make sure it's set up well, and use things like dual rates, exponential on the radio to learn to fly. Expect to crash a lot, but have fun while you're learning. And this is a great hobby with lots of fantastic people in it. So even if you are not near to a radio control club where you can learn some of these kinds of tips and tricks from, asking polite, well thought out questions in places like forum and YouTube videos will normally get you a polite, useful answer. So best of luck and happy flying. If you found that video useful or like the content, then please hit the like and subscribe button down below. If you want to go the extra step, you can become a Patreon of the Painless 360 channel and help provide support for what I do here All the videos created here are put into playlists, so if you're interested in a particular topic, have a look at the playlist, and they all are organised in there to make them easier to use. If you're not sure if there's a video for your particular problem or topic you want to know more about, then add Painless 360 to the Google search term that you're interested in, and that should find the video, article or content about the particular thing that you're interested in having a look at.